Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honour to come and talk to such a distinguished audience. And I'd like to thank Dr. Nebo and Professor Wilson for inviting me. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of boxing, to put boxing into context, and it's something that interests me. And I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing into boxing injuries. This is where I work, amongst other places. Okay, can't work there. So that's UCLH, which is a large London teaching hospital, and that's where the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health is based. Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health is an Olympic legacy building. We had £10 million after the London 2012 Olympics, and the institute in London is part of the National Institute of Sport and Exercise Medicine. And one day a week I spend in Sheffield, here at the Great Britain Boxing Gym, where I look after both the male and female Olympic boxing team, as well as some of the potential boxing team and some of the junior teams as well. And that's a lot of fun. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of boxing. And I'll start off with the prehistory. So, boxing is one of the oldest sports, if not the... Whoops, that's not good. If not the oldest sport. Okay. Now, would you be concerned if you came across this chap in a boxing match? He looks a bit like a Russian, but he's not. Now, I wouldn't be too concerned if I came across this guy in a boxing match, because he can't make a fist. In fact, humans are the only great apes, the only primates, in fact, that can make a proper fist, because our fingers are so short. So your hand is designed. There's been some evolutionary work done in the States by Morgan and Carrier, looking at the human hand and the way it makes a fist. So your hand folds down, your fingers fold down into your palm, your thenar and hypothenar eminence come across to lock that in place, then your thumb comes across. What that does is it gives you a weapon, a club, which is very handy. You don't have to find anything, you don't have to pick anything up. And you have a useful weapon for beating other apes. The trouble with the other apes is their fingers are too long, so they can't fold it into their hand. They can slap, but they can't punch. And we're also designed to punch in that we can make our fist, it locks into place, we have a club. The second and third metacarpals are rigid on the carpus. They don't move. There's no angle of movement. That gives us a very solid line right up to the elbow. So you can punch through there and it's completely solid. Apes can't do that. The idea is that this gave us an evolutionary advantage, and that humans that could create a fist better and could punch better and could punch harder were more successful, gained more mates, and bred better. That's probably still true today. Now, this is a clay plaque from Iran from 2000, around about 2000 BC. Now, I think you'll agree that there is no doubt what these two people are doing. These two people are boxing. Not only, I mean, it's very recognizable as boxing. They're actually, they've got strapping around their hands, and they're hitting each other in the head. So, this is 4,000 years ago. So already we're talking about a sport organized 4,000 years ago. And there's also evidence from elsewhere around the world, all from around about 2000 BC, from China, from India, and from South America, that boxing, when you start to get recorded history, when writing starts and when you can start to record things, boxing is recorded as a sport. So it developed simultaneously across the world. And if you think perhaps there is an evolutionary advantage from being able to punch, that's perhaps not surprising. So, let's talk about the ancient Greeks, because a lot of our knowledge of boxing comes from the paintings, the pottery, and the writings from ancient Greece. This is from the Iliad, and it's really a good idea of how boxing hasn't perhaps changed that much in the last 3,000 years. So, let the man come up who will carry off the two-handed goblet. So this is before the fight. So this is the press conference before the fight. And the two-handed goblet is what the loser gets. So the loser gets the two-handed goblet. I say no other Arcanians will beat me at boxing and lead off the Jenny. The first prize is a working donkey. So this guy's going to win the working donkey. I claim I am the champion. So I have a bit of trash talking at the beginning, as I'm sure you're familiar with now in professional boxing. I will smash his skin apart and break his bones. Let those who take care of him wait nearby, huddle about him and carry him out after my fists have beaten him under. So, this guy's giving it large, because he is the champion. Now, the fight goes ahead, and the challenger is knocked unconscious. And I think this is a really good description of being knocked unconscious in a boxing match. As in the water roughened by the north wind, a fish jumps in the weed off the beach break. So he's no longer concentrating on the boxing match. His mind has gone to other things. And then the dark water closes over above him. I think that's a really good description of being knocked unconscious. Anybody been knocked unconscious here? Oh, just me then. Okay. So, the aftermath. The challenger, feet dragging as he spat up the thick blood and rolled his head to one side. He was dizzy when they brought him back and set him among them. So, the challenger didn't do too well. But they themselves, these are the seconds in the corner, went and carried off the two-handed goblet. So, as usual, the agent and the trainer carries off the prize, and the boxer is left in the corner, dizzy and bloodied. So, some things don't change. I guess that's human nature. Now, this is a very famous statue of bronze, and this is the seated boxer. And all sorts of things have been attributed to this statue. This is the boxer at the end of his career. Maybe he's been defeated. Maybe he's looking round at the opponent that's won. There's been quite a lot written about this statue. But I'd like to interpret it in a slightly different way. The statue has cauliflower ears, and on one of the cauliflower ears there is cuts, and the cuts are shown bleeding by copper inlay. And it's interesting that the term cauliflower ear is not a modern term. It's a term that was originally coined by Plato to describe the Spartans. The Spartans were very keen boxers and very good boxers, but they were deformed by boxing. And one of the things they got was cauliflower ears. And Plato, who looked down on the Spartans slightly, coined the term cauliflower ears as a term of insult for recognizing Spartans. And also the face is badly cut up. You can see, I don't know whether you can see there, but there's cuts here, there's cuts here, there's cuts here, there's cut across the nose, there's cut on the lip. Which is interesting as a boxing doctor, because these are very accurate sort of cuts that we get. Now, I have a slide that I show to ringside doctors when we're talking about cuts and when to stop a fight. And this is it's not as elegant, okay, it's not as elegant as the Greek statue, but this is the slide I use. And interestingly, it's got all the same cuts, because these are the dangerous cuts that we need to stop the bout for. So I just wonder whether the seated boxer is not in fact just a romantic interpretation of a boxer, but just an ancient teaching aid. If you think that boxing had been going on in Greek times for 1,000 years, it may have been worthwhile producing such an elegant teaching aid to show doctors what was required. In fact, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, is only thought to have written 4 of the 70 volumes of his medical textbook. And his trainer, Herodicus, was in fact a trainer, and a trainer of athletes and a trainer of boxers. And the 4 volumes that Hippocrates wrote were about injuries in the face, which are not injuries of war, but are injuries of sport and sport boxing. So it's possible that this was an important topic, and maybe, sports medicine is in fact the oldest form of medicine. So we'll move on a bit. The Romans eventually turned boxing into a much more bloody affair, with spiked gloves and all sorts of little innovations to make it much more bloody, much more dangerous, and much more vicious. Boxing was eventually banned by the Romans in 500 BC, because the Christian emperor then decided that because of the deformation of the face, because man was made in God's image, then you shouldn't box. Then there was a period that the Dark Ages came. There was a lot of war and pestilence, and sport was generally took into the background. There is some reports from around about 1000 AD in England, which talks about knights being taught to fight with their hands. And then when around about 1500, when Henry VIII took power, there was more money, there was slightly less war, and sport was encouraged because Henry VIII was a very keen sportsman, and boxing was one of the sports that was encouraged. And then we had the British Civil War, English Civil War, and where there was a very strict religious clampdown, and sport was stopped. And then with the reformation of the monarchy, sport started up again in a big way. And the first mention we have in the printed press in England is in 1681 in the Protestant Mercury, where there was a boxing match between the Duke of Albemarle's footman and a butcher. The butcher had boxed many times and was considered the champion of England. And that's an interesting passage from the paper, because one, it shows that the sport was supported by the aristocracy in England, and also that it was organised so that people knew who the champion was. So clearly this was an ongoing sport. I'm just going to run through James Figg. James Figg's an interesting character who started organising boxing in the early 1700s, and in fact set up a gym in Tottenham Court Road, which is where the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health is now. So a very close association. And James Figg publicised and improved boxing. And around about this sort of time, the English were going out to do the Grand Tour. And the Grand Tour consisted of learning about the history of mainly Greece and Rome. And of course boxing was huge in Greece, so the aristocracy were now getting very interested in boxing. But there was a problem with boxing, and that was death disfigurement. And there's always been it's always been difficult. Always been a difficult sport to sell to people of a sensitive disposition, and there's always been problems with people being killed in boxing. This is a thing from the Northampton Mercury in 1736, and this is deaths in the previous week in London. And as you can see, there was 144 deaths from convulsions, 83 from smallpox, 20 from dropsy, and they had a separate column for the weekly deaths killed by boxing. In this case, 2. To give you an idea of the sort of thing that was going on, in 1833, Simon Byrne fought James Deafin Burke. I understand he was deaf. Now, Byrne was knocked out in the 96th round of their championship fight and died 3 days later. By the time he was knocked out, he was blinded in one eye. So this is quite a tough sport to take part in. There was quite an outcry about this particular death, because Byrne was a popular boxer, although in fact in his previous fight Byrne had killed his opponent in another fight. But Deafin Burke had to leave the UK and go to the States to continue his boxing career out there. And then there was trouble with women, and he had to come back to England again. So there's not always been support for the sport. And the Illustrated London News in 1845 said, "For years the practice of pugilism has been revolting to mankind, degrading to all honourable and honest feelings of human nature." And there is still a sort of split where people seem to either like boxing or really not like it very much. But because of the increase in, or the awareness of the deaths and disfigurement, the Queensberry rules, which was one of a whole set of rules that had came in 1865, and the Queensberry rules are quite important because they did some major things that changed. They changed from bare knuckle boxing with bare fists, to boxing with gloves. The Queensberry rules were the first rules that brought gloves in as mandatory. They also introduced a standard size for the ring, and the ropes around the ring were initially there to keep the spectators out rather than to keep the boxers in. Spectators would come in and stab or hit the boxer that they hadn't gambled on. So it's becoming a little bit more civilized. In 1880, the Amateur Boxing Association was established, and this was so that gentlemen could box, so that the likes of people sitting in this audience could do some boxing and not necessarily be knocked out. So although the Queensberry rules, it was still a knockout, ended the competition, or somebody submitted or gave way. With amateur boxing, it was only 3 rounds. It was for gentlemen, so you had to have a point system. So the introduction of amateur boxing meant that you had to have a point system. Once you had a point system, it meant you didn't have to be knocked out. You were wearing gloves, which meant that your face didn't get quite so badly disfigured. So amateur boxing became very, very important. And the title of this chapter was Boxing the English Sport. Boxing was considered to be an English sport because it consisted of beating your opponent with fists, which generally didn't kill you. Unlike the French sport, which was fencing, and so it was considered that duelling with swords was a much more dangerous sport, and the French were slightly more effete than the English, and so that boxing became the English sport. And then, of course, in 1900, boxing was introduced into the modern Olympics. And only apart from 1912, when it was not allowed in Sweden because it was banned in Sweden, it's been in every Olympics since and has become a major worldwide sport. The last World Championships, there were 77 different countries competing, and there are over 1 million, approximately, we don't know exactly, but around about 1 million people boxing throughout the world. Boxing's a very easy sport to do. You don't need very much. You just need a pair of gloves. Now, despite this, and despite the huge history of boxing, modern medical knowledge on boxing is really very limited. I did a PubMed search last night, just so it was up to date. And rugby, I don't know whether you know what rugby is. Rugby is a very small sport that is very limited in the number of countries that do it. There's a couple of northern hemisphere countries and a couple of southern hemisphere countries. I'm not very familiar with rugby, but it's not a very big sport. There were 4,283 papers on rugby injuries. And of course, rugby's not a very old sport. We're not talking about a 4,000-year-old sport here. We're talking about a 150-year-old sport. When did Webb pick up the ball and run? It wasn't that long ago. So anyway, 483 papers on rugby injuries. There's quite a lot of doctors play rugby. That may be it. Papers on boxing injuries, a sport at least 1,000 times older, 771. I just looked at lacrosse injuries because I thought that was another minority sport. And lacrosse, 770. So lacrosse, again, a very limited number of people playing it. Rugby, a limited number of people playing it. Boxing, a worldwide sport. So very little known, really, medically about boxing. Surprisingly so, I thought. So, I just want to go through a little bit of the research I'm doing. So we looked at, I've been working with the GB Boxing Squad for 18 years, and we started collecting data on them in 2003, and it got useful in about 2005. And this is, when you're collecting injury data, I think it's the most difficult thing about collecting injury data is not when they got injured, and it's not what the injury is. The most difficult thing about collecting injury data is when the injury finished. And to do that, we surveyed all the boxers on the squad every week, so we knew whether they were injured or not injured, and that gave us a finishing date for their injury. And from 2005 to 2009, there were 297 injuries were recorded. And this is a Z scores for the injuries that we found in the GB Boxing Squad. And as you can see, hand injuries and wrist injuries, so hand and wrist injuries, are a huge proportion of the injuries that we got. Not only were hand and wrist injuries the largest proportion, they also required the most time to recover from. So we have an injury that's common, and it takes a long time to get back from. Interesting, in this period, head injuries and concussion were virtually nil. We had 2 concussions in this period. But concussion is always a worry. It's a worry for everybody now, getting sued for £1 billion. You don't want that. So we looked at training, injuries in training, and again, hand and wrist, very high. And we looked at competition, hand and wrist, very high. In fact, the number of injuries in competition was the same as the number of injuries, almost exactly the same, within a couple of injuries, as the number of injuries in training. So the number of injuries in competition, same as the number of injuries in training. But boxers spend 1,000 times more hours in training than they do in competition. And about 50% of this time is spent in punching activity. So the injury rate in competition is approximately 500 times higher than training. Now that's a big difference, So really wanted to know why that was and what we could do about it to try and reduce our injury rates. So to do that, we decided to use pressure film. Now, this is Fuji pressure film, and it's generally used in engineering to look at the flatness of surfaces. And what happens is that when the pressure film's exposed, small bubbles of dye burst at different pressures, and you develop a colour on the film. You scan the film in a very expensive scanner, and it changes the depth of the colour into a pressure reading, which you can then tell what the pressure was. And it's good for looking at if you're doing a Formula 1 car and you want to make sure the head is completely flat on the block. You can put the pressure film on the block and then put a flat plate on top and just see where the high spots are and then smooth them off. But for boxing, we were looking at something that we can actually measure at the knuckle, because the knuckle is within a wrap, which is the bandaging that goes around the hand, and the hand is put into a glove. But what we wanted to know was what was happening at the knuckle, because we were getting a lot of knuckle injuries and a lot of hand injuries, and we wanted to know the pressure at the knuckle. So we decided to try and use the pressure film to do that. We tried all sorts of different techniques of getting the pressure film across the knuckle, which is quite difficult, because if you think the knuckle's moving around, you can't stick it down. We tried all sorts of things. Tried supergluing it to the boxes at one stage. It didn't really work. Boxers weren't happy. And so what we ended up doing was using 2 pairs of surgical gloves, and then sticking the film between the 2 gloves and resting it over the knuckle, which allowed the hand to move, but the film to stay in place. Oops. And these are some impact scores from each knuckle. So knuckle 1 is the 2nd metacarpal, 2 is the 3rd, 3 is the 4th, and 4 is the 5th, rather confusingly. As you can see, with individual subjects, you get a different pattern of result depending on the shape of the hand. So if you look at your hand, you can probably tell it's usually the 3rd metacarpal that sticks out most, as in this pressure film, and my 3rd knuckle sticks out the most, which is not surprising because this is my result. As you can see, the 2nd knuckle is by far the largest pressure when punching. But it's different for different people depending on the shapes of their hands. And this is a boxer who had broken his 4th metacarpal, 3rd knuckle, and that sat much lower down in his wrist, so obviously there was much less pressure there. So this technique of measuring pressure at the knuckle may be important when we try to redesign wraps and when we try to redesign gloves, so that we can see whether we're changing the pressure at the knuckle, see whether we're redistributing it so it's more even. I just want to talk briefly about head guards, because head guards are a hot topic at the moment. They're a hot topic because they've gone, and they're a hot topic because obviously concussion and all head injury at the moment is a very important subject. And as there are blows aimed at the head in boxing. The removal of head guards has been quite interesting. So, as you can see, this is then, and this is now, and that's Big Joe Joyce. Joe's boxing out here in the World Championships. Interestingly, Joe won the gold medal at the European Championships, and he was the only one on the podium because he'd hospitalised both his opponents in the quarter-final and the semi-final. So, if you want to come along, please do. So anyway, back to head guards and concussion. So head guards were first used in the Olympics. They were introduced into the Olympics in 1984. And they were brought into the Olympics under pressure from the American Medical Association, who were concerned about the injuries that you could get in boxing. And they were just head guards that people had used in training. So there was no science involved. They just put the head guards on as a reaction to the American Medical Association. And they've been on since 1984. They were removed in 2013, partly as a response to a paper written by Bianco, which looked at the rule changes of amateur boxing for the previous 59 years. And it clearly showed that when head guards were introduced into boxing, the number of knockouts doubled, which seemed odd. It's always difficult to look at health and rule changes, particularly if they don't occur simultaneously. And when you change one rule, other things change. So you've got to take these results with a degree of suspicion. 'suspicion. 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 the IOC were interested in whether the injuries were increasing or decreasing in boxing, particularly the head injuries. So what we did was we got the results from AIBA, which is the national governing body of boxing, and they looked at the stoppages. This is the referees stopping the bout for blows to the head, not for any other blow, not for any other injury, but from blows to the head. And the stoppages from Milan, which was the World Championships in Milan, World Championships in Baku, both with head guards, and then the World Championships in Almaty without head guards. And there was a big drop in the stoppages when the head guards were removed, which sort of corresponded to the historical data of the number of stoppages increasing when the head guards were put on. So that was interesting. But again, it's the difficulty with this is to try and power the study high enough, because there are very low numbers of knockouts and concussions in boxing, particularly in Olympic boxing. So the numbers are very, very low. So you have to be a bit suspicious of this data, because it could just be a one-off that Almaty, you have 2 fewer knockouts, and then all of a sudden the stats change quite considerably. So take that with a pinch of salt. Now the other interesting thing, Milan was, so 2009 is in blue, Baku is in red, and 2013 without the head guards is in green. And this is a number of cuts. And as you can see, clearly what the head guards do is they protect against cuts. There was a 310% increase in cuts in Almaty compared with the 2 previous World Championships. And that's not really surprising, because head guards were originally designed to stop people getting cut when they were sparring. Because what you don't want is you don't want to get cut before you're about to fight, because obviously it's going to stop you fighting. So head guards were always designed to stop cuts. They were never designed to stop concussion. And in fact, a lot of the evidence, in fact, most of the evidence that I've seen shows that helmets and head guards do not protect against concussion. Concussion is caused by the movement of the head. So if you're wearing a helmet or not wearing a helmet, it makes no difference. Which is a slight concern about rugby and introducing head guards into rugby. So what we decided to do was to try and increase those numbers, to try and increase the numbers we have for neurological changes. We decided to look at the video of the World Championships from 2011 with head guards compared with the Championships of 2013 without head guards. This was to try and get the numbers higher so that we could maybe see if there was a difference between the 2 groups. And we used metrics that have been used in other sports, that have been used in Australian rules football, that have been used in ice hockey, to look at changes on the video that may correspond to a concussive injury. And these were loss of responsiveness, impact seizure, slow to get up, motor incoordination, ragdoll appearance, rough, blank and vacant look. And then we also looked at the cuts that they were getting as well. So when we looked at the video evidence, so if you look at the number of incidents, at the bottom here, you can see again there's a decrease in 2013. But when you look at it, the rate per 1,000 minutes, 58 to 48, and although that is a 17% reduction, again the significance is difficult to really tell, because even with looking at all the neurological factors, although that increased our numbers considerably, we're still probably a little way off a decent power calculation for this. But again, if you look at cuts, 42 in 2011, 137. And so if you look per 1,000 minutes, you've gone from 8.3 to 34.1, which is highly significant, no doubt about that. So I think what we can say is that head guards don't seem to protect against concussion. There certainly doesn't seem to be an increase in concussion or knockouts or stoppages due to blows to the head when the head guards are on. They don't seem to protect against concussion. And that fits in with other research evidence that there is around rugby injuries, skiing injuries, etc. And you've got to wonder why that is, and so why is it not helping? And there's various theories. Is it because the head guard restricts the vision, so the boxer can't see the punch coming around the corner that spins their head? Is it because, well, we looked at where the blows landed, and 50% of the blows didn't land on the head guard. 50% of the blows landed on the chin, on the face. So that halves your figures. So 50% of the blows doesn't matter anyway, whether you're wearing a head guard or not. But probably, I think the most likely explanation is the fact that if you're wearing a head guard, you feel confident, you box in a slightly different way, you tend to lead with your head forward, and you're happy to take a blow going in so that you can get your blows off to score points. And I suspect that's the reason that head guards don't make much difference. And also it's the head movement that causes the problems. So future work. I mean, the IOC have become very interested. The Olympic Organising Committee has become very interested in safety in sport, and boxing being an Olympic sport, they've become interested in that. And so I'm working with the IOC, and I'm working with AIBA to implement a strategy to scrutinise the sport over at least the next 5 years. And this is really important I think it's important for the sport, I think it's important for combat sports in general, to see, so that they can show that the level of concussion isn't as high as people are concerned about, particularly in boxing. So we're going to look at, we're going to carry on with a video analysis. We spent all of yesterday psychometrically testing a group of boxers. We're looking at balance testing. You can get some quite sophisticated balance testing, which we can do before and after bouts. And we're going to look at eye movements as well to see if we can detect concussion by change in eye movements before and after bouts. For hand injuries, which are obviously a big problem, although not as high up on the agenda as concussion, we need to look at new gloves. We need to look at the way that the thumb is bound into the glove, because we get a lot of thumb injuries. And we need to look at allowing more tape and hand wraps in competition, where there's 500 times more injuries than there is in training, because the hand wraps in competition are much lighter than they are in training. And the use of tape, like the professionals do, to tape the hands up and give them more protection. As far as cuts are concerned, obviously there's been a 310% increase in cuts. So we're looking at ways of reducing those cuts. And one of them is the use of Kevlar, which is an interesting product from 3M, which is used in bed sores to improve the condition of the skin. And it reduces bed sores amazingly. I mean, the results are extraordinary. And we've been using it on boxers' faces to try and stop them getting cut. And so far, the preliminary results from some pilots that we've done has shown that it's made quite a big impact on stopping cuts. Again, the numbers are not there yet. We've got 150 boxers. We need 499 to power the study properly. Also looking at glove material to see whether the glove material itself can be changed to stop it cutting the boxers so badly. And who knows, maybe head guards will be reintroduced to stop cuts but not stop concussion. So, I'd like to thank the English Institute of Sport, the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health, GB Boxing, the International Boxing Federation, the IOC, and many more people who've helped with the research work that we've been doing and hopefully is ongoing. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.